A freezing night. A poor 8-year-old girl spent her last coins on a tiny birthday cake not for herself, but for an old janitor everyone ignored. Minutes later, he was accused of stealing a diamond watch. What happened next shocked a billionaire and changed 3 lives forever. Snow drifted slowly through the glowing streets of Ashbourne, Massachusetts, soft flakes swirling beneath the golden lights of Vale Galleria, the most luxurious shopping complex in the city. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors, and expensive perfumes floated through the warm air. Wealth moved easily here, silk coats, quiet laughter, and credit cards that never declined. Outside, however, winter was unforgiving. A long black car rolled to a smooth stop beneath the grand entrance. The driver stepped out quickly and opened the rear door. Caspian Vale 39 emerged without hurry, tall, impeccably dressed in a dark wool coat. The billionaire founder of Vale Enterprises carried himself with calm authority. His name was known across financial headlines, whispered in boardrooms and business magazines. But tonight, as he stepped onto the marble walkway, his face held the same distant stillness it always did. Another meeting finished, another contract signed, another victory that somehow felt empty. Caspian adjusted his gloves and began walking toward the entrance. Then he noticed something small. At the far corner of the bakery window stood a tiny girl wrapped in a faded green coat that was clearly too thin for the cold. She was standing on tiptoe trying to see inside the glass display. Caspian slowed. The girl reached into her pocket and carefully poured a handful of coins onto the counter, pennies, nickels, a single scratched dime. Her fingers were red from the cold as she counted them again and again. Caspian watched silently. It was strange to see such fragile poverty, standing only a few feet away from so much glittering wealth. The baker leaned forward. "What would you like, sweetheart?" The little girl studied the bright cakes inside the display case. Then she quietly pointed to the smallest cake in the entire shop. The bakery smelled warm and sweet, a comforting contrast to the bitter wind outside. Behind the glass counter, rows of decorated cakes shimmered under soft lights, chocolate towers, strawberry layers, golden pastries dusted with sugar. The little girl stood very still, her eyes moving slowly across them all, not with longing, but with careful thought. Finally, she pointed again to the smallest cake in the display, a simple round sponge cake with plain white frosting and a single candle resting beside it. The baker glanced down at the coins scattered across the counter. He counted them once, then again. He looked back at the girl. "That's almost enough," he said gently. The girl lowered her eyes. "Oh," she whispered. For a moment she seemed ready to gather the coins and leave, but the baker quietly slid the cake toward her anyway. "Looks like you counted just right." The girl's face lit up with a soft, surprised smile. "Really, really?" She carefully gathered the coins and pushed them across the counter, making sure none were missing. Then she lifted the small white box with both hands, as if it were something precious. From the doorway, Caspian Vale watched the exchange. He assumed what anyone else would assume. Perhaps tonight was the girl's birthday. Perhaps she had saved her coins for weeks to buy that tiny cake. For a brief second, he almost smiled. But then something strange happened. Instead of leaving the mall and heading home to celebrate, the girl turned and walked away from the bright shopping halls. She moved quietly toward the dim service corridor behind the luxury wing. Caspian hesitated. Then, without quite knowing why, he followed. The cheerful music of the shopping mall faded as Caspian followed the girl deeper into the service corridor. Here the world looked very different. Gone were the chandeliers and perfume displays. The walls were plain concrete. The lights buzzed softly overhead. Cleaning carts stood beside gray doors marked "Staff Only." The little girl walked slowly, holding the cake box close to her chest. She stopped near the end of the hallway. An elderly man was there, kneeling on the marble floor with a mop and a bucket beside him. His back was slightly bent with age. His uniform was faded, the name patch stitched above his pocket reading M. Grady. He was carefully scrubbing a stubborn stain from the floor, working patiently, as if the rest of the world had long since forgotten he existed. The girl stepped closer. "Mr. Grady?" The old man looked up in surprise. "Ellie," his tired face softened when he saw her. "What are you doing here this late, little one?" Instead of answering, the girl set the cake box gently on a nearby crate. She opened the lid. Inside was the tiny white cake. She carefully placed the candle into the frosting and lit it with a small match. The flickering flame illuminated her small face. Then she smiled. "Happy birthday, Mr. Grady." The old janitor froze. For a moment, he simply stared at the candle as if trying to understand what he was seeing. "No one remembered," he murmured. Ellie shrugged shyly. "I did." From the shadows at the end of the corridor, Caspian Vale stood completely still. The billionaire who owned the entire building watched as the little girl began softly singing, "Happy birthday to you." The small flame from the candle flickered gently in the quiet service corridor. For a long moment, Marlo Grady, 73, simply stared at it. His tired hands were still wrapped around the handle of the mop, frozen in place, as if time had suddenly slowed. "Ellie," he whispered. "You remembered," the little girl nodded shyly. Ilawan Ellie Hart, 8, pushed the small cake box closer to him. "You told me last winter," she said softly. "You said birthdays feel colder when nobody says your name." The old janitor blinked several times. His eyes had grown watery. "Well, I didn't think anyone was listening." Ellie shrugged. "I was." She lifted the candle again so the flame wouldn't blow out from the hallway draft. "Make a wish." Marlo chuckled weakly. "Oh, sweetheart. I'm too old for wishes." But Ellie shook her head. "No one's too old." The old man slowly leaned forward and blew out the candle. The tiny flame disappeared into the dim corridor. Ellie began singing in a soft, gentle voice, "Happy birthday to you." Her voice was small, almost fragile, but it filled the empty hallway in a way that felt strangely powerful. Marlo wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Behind them, hidden in the shadows near the elevator doors, Caspian Vale stood perfectly still. The billionaire who owned the entire building. The man who had just closed a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And yet the sight before him, a poor child giving away everything she had for someone the world ignored, struck him harder than any boardroom victory ever had. For the first time in years, Caspian felt something in his chest begin to break open. Marlo looked down at the small cake again. It was barely larger than his hand, but to him it looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Ellie," he said gently, "where did you get the money for this?" The little girl sat on an overturned crate beside him. "Oh, I saved it." "You saved it." She nodded. "I sold flowers outside the train station this week." Marlo frowned with concern. "In this weather, it's okay," she said quickly. "I stand near the coffee shop doors so the wind doesn't hit me too much." The old man sighed. "But sweetheart, you should have spent that money on yourself. You need warm food more than I need cake." Ellie shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice was quiet but firm. "You always let me sit by the heater in the service hallway when it's really cold." Marlo opened his mouth to protest, but Ellie continued. "And last week when the delivery man dropped all those boxes, you helped him carry them even though your back hurt." She looked down at her shoes. "So I thought, maybe your birthday shouldn't feel lonely." The words were simple, but they landed heavily in the cold corridor. From the shadows, Caspian Vale felt his throat tighten. A child who barely had enough to eat had spent an entire week working in the freezing cold just to make someone else feel remembered. Something stung behind his eyes. For years, people had praised Caspian for his success, his intelligence, his empire. but tonight. A little girl with a $3 cake had just shown him what real wealth looked like. Caspian Vale had witnessed thousands of deals in his life, hostile takeovers, negotiations worth billions, but nothing had ever made him feel the strange, tight pressure now forming in his chest. The scene in the hallway felt almost sacred. Ellie carefully cut the small cake using a plastic fork the bakery had included. She handed the first piece to Marlowe. "For the birthday man." Marlowe laughed softly. "Then the second piece is yours." "No," Ellie said, shaking her head. "You should have 2 pieces. It's your day." The old janitor tried to argue, but she insisted. Finally, he broke the slice in half and handed part of it back to her. "Then we share it." Ellie smiled. They both took a bite at the same time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was the quiet happiness of people who rarely received kindness. Behind them, Caspian felt something unexpected happen. A tear slid quietly down his cheek. He didn't even realize it until it reached his jaw. He wiped it away quickly, almost embarrassed. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried. Perhaps at his father's funeral many years ago. But now, watching a child give away everything she had, he felt the world shift inside him. The billionaire stepped forward slightly, about to reveal himself. He wanted to say something, anything. But before he could speak, the silence of the corridor was suddenly shattered. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and an angry voice barked sharply, "Grady, what exactly do you think you're doing?" The warm moment in the corridor shattered instantly. Heavy footsteps echoed across the tile floor. A tall man in a sharp gray suit stormed down the hallway, followed by 2 security guards. His expression was cold and irritated. Dorian Pike, 48, the operations director of Vale Galleria. His eyes immediately landed on the old janitor. "Grady," he snapped. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marlowe slowly stood up, his back stiff with age. "I was just finishing the hallway, sir." Dorian's gaze moved to the cake box, and celebrating birthdays while on the clock, his voice carried sharp contempt. Ellie quickly stepped closer to Marlowe. "It's his birthday," she said softly. Dorian barely glanced at her. He turned back to Marlowe. "That's not the problem." He pulled a folded report from his coat pocket. A guest in the VIP lounge reported a missing diamond watch worth $40,000. The hallway went silent. Marlowe frowned in confusion. A watch security stepped forward. Dorian continued, his voice calm but ruthless. "Surveillance shows you near the lounge entrance 20 minutes before the watch disappeared." The old janitor blinked in disbelief. "I only cleaned the hallway outside." Dorian didn't react. "Until this investigation is complete, you are suspended immediately." Ellie stepped forward suddenly. "He didn't steal anything." Her small voice echoed through the hallway. The guards looked uncomfortable, but Dorian simply sighed. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Ellie." "Well, Ellie," he said flatly, "this matter doesn't concern you." Behind them, standing quietly in the shadows, Caspian Vale's expression slowly hardened. The situation escalated quickly. One of the security guards stepped beside Marlowe. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Marlowe looked confused and frightened. "I've worked here 15 years, he said quietly. "I've never taken anything." Dorian's face remained emotionless. "That will be determined by the investigation." Ellie grabbed Marlowe's sleeve. "He didn't do it," she said desperately, but the corridor door opened just then. A few shoppers walking past the service entrance stopped to look. Within seconds, whispers began spreading. "Someone stole something." "The janitor." Marlowe lowered his head. The humiliation was worse than the accusation itself. The guards began leading him toward the exit. Ellie hurried beside them. "You're making a mistake." Dorian shook his head impatiently. "This employee is being removed pending investigation." His voice was loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "To protect our guests, The words felt like a public verdict. Marlowe looked down at the cake still resting on the crate. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he murmured. "You shouldn't have spent your money." Ellie shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It's your birthday." The old janitor gave her a sad smile. Not much of one now. In the background, Caspian Vale watched everything unfold. The billionaire's jaw tightened. He had seen ruthless decisions before. But this felt wrong. Very wrong. And the worst part was that everyone around them seemed ready to accept the accusation without question. Everyone except one small girl. The hallway had grown crowded. A few shoppers had gathered near the entrance, curious about the commotion. The security guards continued guiding Marlowe toward the exit. Ellie hurried after them, still holding the small cake box. "Please stop," she cried. He didn't steal anything, but in her rush, her foot caught the edge of a cleaning bucket. The box slipped from her hands. Time seemed to slow. The small white cake tumbled through the air. Then splat. It hit the tile floor. The frosting shattered against the ground. The tiny candle rolled across the hallway. Ellie froze. For a moment, she just stared at the ruined cake. Her entire week of saving coins, gone in an instant. Marlowe stopped walking. He turned slowly, his face filled with quiet heartbreak. "Oh, Ellie." The guards paused awkwardly. Ellie knelt down, trying to scoop the cake back into the box with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I ruined your birthday." Marlowe quickly crouched beside her despite his aching knees. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "You gave me the best birthday I've had in years." Ellie wiped her eyes. Behind them, Caspian Vale watched the scene. The broken cake on the floor, the frightened old man being escorted away, and the small girl apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. Something inside him snapped. The billionaire stepped forward at last. His voice cut through the hallway like steel. "Stop!" Every head turned. Caspian Vale looked directly at the security guards. No one takes that man anywhere. The corridor fell silent. The corridor went completely silent. Security guards froze mid-step. The small crowd that had gathered near the service entrance stopped whispering. Every pair of eyes turned toward the tall man who had just spoken. Caspian Vale stepped forward slowly. The polished marble floor reflected the overhead lights beneath his shoes as he walked into the center of the hallway. Dorian Pike's expression changed instantly. "Mr. Vale." His voice carried a sudden stiffness. The security guards released their grip on Marlowe immediately. Ellie blinked in confusion. She had no idea who this man was, but something about the way everyone reacted told her he was important. Very important. Caspian looked briefly at the broken cake on the floor, the smeared frosting, the candle lying on its side, the coins still inside the empty bakery box. His eyes darkened. Then he lifted his gaze toward Dorian. "Explain," Caspian said calmly. Dorian cleared his throat. "A guest reported a missing diamond watch from the VIP lounge," he replied. "Our surveillance shows this employee near the area shortly before the item disappeared." Caspian glanced toward Marlowe. The old janitor stood quietly, his shoulders slightly hunched. "I didn't take anything," Marlowe said gently. "I only cleaned the hallway." Ellie stepped closer to him. "He's telling the truth," she insisted. Dorian sighed impatiently. "With respect, Mr. Vale, we're following standard procedure." But Caspian's voice cut through the hallway like ice. "No." The word echoed. "We are not escorting him out." Dorian frowned. "Sir, the evidence you said surveillance," Caspian interrupted. "Yes." "Then we review it." The operations director hesitated. "That footage has already been checked by security." Caspian took another step forward. His presence filled the corridor. "Then we will check it again." His eyes moved briefly to the broken cake, then back to Marlowe. "No one loses their livelihood in my building based on assumptions." The security guards exchanged uneasy glances. Dorian forced a thin smile. Of course, Mr. Vale. Caspian turned slightly. Bring the security footage to my office. Then he looked down at Ellie. She was still kneeling beside the ruined cake. Carefully, Caspian bent down and picked up the small candle. He placed it gently back in the box. Don't worry, he told her quietly. This story isn't finished yet. The staff lounge inside Vale Galleria was warm and quiet. Soft yellow lights glowed above a long wooden table. For the first time that night, Ellie felt the cold leave her fingers. She sat carefully in the chair, her small boots dangling above the floor. Across from her, Marlowe Grady sat with his hands folded nervously. He still looked shaken. Caspian Vale stood near the window watching the falling snow outside. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Caspian turned. What's your name? He asked the girl. Elowen Hart, she replied politely. But everyone calls me Ellie. How old are you? 8. Caspian nodded slowly. And you bought that cake tonight? Ellie glanced at the broken box sitting on the table. Yes. Why? The question seemed simple, but Ellie answered it seriously. Because it was his birthday. Marlowe shifted uncomfortably. You didn't have to do that, sweetheart. Ellie shook her head. I wanted to. Caspian studied her. You saved money for it, she nodded. I sell flowers outside the Ashbourne train station after school. You do that every day, most days, she said. What about your parents? Ellie hesitated. My mom passed away 2 years ago. The room grew quiet. I live with my Aunt Clara now, she continued softly. She's sick a lot, so I try to help with rent. Caspian's expression changed slightly. Despite everything she carried, the girl spoke with calm dignity, not a hint of bitterness. Marlowe cleared his throat. She's the kindest kid you'll ever meet, he said quietly. She sits near the service heater when it gets cold. I let her warm up sometimes. Ellie smiled shyly. He also feeds the stray cat behind the loading dock. Caspian raised an eyebrow. Does he? Ellie nodded seriously. He always saves half his sandwich. The billionaire looked at the old janitor again. The man accused of stealing a $40,000 watch. A man who shared his lunch with a stray cat. Something about that accusation suddenly felt even more impossible. Caspian turned toward the door. I think it's time we looked at that footage. The security control room overlooked the entire shopping complex. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each displaying different parts of Vale Galleria. Parking garages, luxury boutiques, escalators, hallways. Caspian Vale stood behind the main console. Dorian Pike stood beside him, arms folded. Camera 47, Dorian said. One of the screens switched to a recording from earlier that evening. The VIP corridor appeared. Elegant, quiet, nearly empty. A timestamp glowed in the corner. Dorian pointed. There. The footage showed Marlowe Grady pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. He paused near the entrance to the VIP lounge, then continued past. That's when the watch went missing, Dorian explained. Caspian watched silently. The footage continued. Nothing happened, just empty hallway. He frowned. Rewind 10 seconds. The technician obeyed. The clip played again. This time, Caspian leaned closer. Something felt off. Pause. The screen froze. Caspian pointed at the timestamp. Why does the recording jump here? The technician blinked. What do you mean, Sir? Caspian pointed again. The time skipped forward by several seconds. Dorian spoke quickly. That happens sometimes with the system. Caspian didn't answer. Play the previous camera. Another screen activated. This one showed the corner near the luxury watch display. For a brief moment, a security supervisor appeared in the reflection of a glass panel. He moved quickly through the corridor, then disappeared from view. Caspian's eyes narrowed. Zoom that reflection. The technician enlarged the image. It was blurry, but something glinted in the man's hand. Dorian shifted uncomfortably. That angle is probably irrelevant. Caspian didn't look away from the screen. No, he said quietly. I don't think it is. Behind him, the control room had grown completely silent, because for the first time that night, the story of the missing watch no longer looked so simple. The security room remained silent except for the low hum of monitors and ventilation. Caspian Vale stood perfectly still, staring at the paused image on the screen. The reflection was faint, distorted by the polished glass of a luxury display case, but it was clear enough to show a figure moving quickly through the VIP corridor. The technician zoomed in further, and although the face was blurred, the uniform was unmistakable. It wasn't Marlo Grady. It was one of the mall's own security supervisors. Dorian Pike shifted his weight beside Caspian, trying to sound calm, but there was a tension in his voice now that hadn't been there before. That reflection could be anyone, he said carefully. Glass reflections can distort images. We can't draw conclusions from that. Caspian didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, studying every pixel, as if the truth were hidden inside the shadows. After a moment, he spoke quietly to the technician. Pull the camera feed from the corridor 10 minutes earlier. The technician typed quickly. Another recording appeared. The corridor was nearly empty, the lights reflecting off the marble floors. Then the same security supervisor walked into view, adjusting something inside his jacket pocket, before disappearing toward the VIP lounge. Caspian watched closely. Play it again, he said. The footage rolled a second time. This time he noticed a small detail most people would miss. The supervisor glanced toward the ceiling camera before stepping out of frame. It was a brief glance, almost instinctive, but it told Caspian something important. The man knew exactly where the cameras were. Dorian folded his arms tighter. Sir, with respect, our team already investigated this. The timeline clearly places Grady outside the lounge right before the watch went missing. Caspian finally turned toward him. His voice was calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it. And yet the footage you presented skips 7 seconds. Dorian frowned. Technical glitch. Caspian's gaze returned to the screen. 7 seconds is enough time for someone to walk into the lounge, remove a watch from a display, and leave. The technician hesitated before speaking. Sir, if someone accessed the system manually, they could also remove a segment of recording. The room fell silent again. Caspian slowly exhaled. What had started as a simple accusation was now beginning to feel like something far more deliberate. He thought about the broken cake on the floor, the trembling girl trying to scoop frosting back into the box, and the old janitor apologizing for something he had not done. The image tightened something deep inside his chest. Bring me the access logs for the security system tonight, Caspian said. The technician nodded and began pulling files. Dorian looked increasingly uneasy. Caspian glanced once more at the frozen reflection on the screen. Whoever took that watch had not only stolen from a customer, they had tried to bury the truth beneath a convenient scapegoat. And for the first time that evening, Caspian Vale felt certain of one thing: the accusation against Marlo Grady was not a mistake. It was a setup. The deeper Caspian looked into the system logs, the more unsettling the story became. Within minutes, the technician located the access records for the security network. Each login attempt was time-stamped, each modification recorded automatically by the system. Normally, those logs were routine housekeeping, but tonight they revealed something strange. The video segment that had skipped forward by 7 seconds had been manually accessed only minutes before the accusation was reported. The username attached to the access request belonged to the security supervisor Caspian had seen reflected in the display glass. The technician swallowed nervously as he showed the screen. Sir, this record indicates the footage was edited before the security report was filed. Caspian's expression hardened. Dorian immediately stepped forward. That doesn't prove anything. Supervisors review footage all the time. Caspian turned slowly toward him. Reviewing footage does not erase it. Dorian's composure began to crack. He cleared his throat and tried another angle. Even if someone accessed the system, that doesn't change the fact that Grady was near the lounge. Caspian walked toward the monitor wall again, replaying the moment where Marlowe's cleaning cart rolled past the corridor. The old man's movements were slow and methodical, exactly what you would expect from someone pushing a heavy mop bucket at the end of a long shift. There was no hesitation, no glance toward the display cases, nothing resembling suspicious behavior. Caspian spoke quietly, almost to himself. "This man has worked here 15 years. The technician nodded. "According to HR records, sir, he started as a maintenance assistant. He's never had a single disciplinary report." Caspian turned toward Dorian again. "So the one time a luxury item disappears, we blame the 73-year-old janitor who has no history of misconduct." Dorian's jaw tightened. It was the most logical lead. "No," Caspian replied coldly. "It was the most convenient one." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched across the room like a tightening wire. Caspian finally addressed the technician again. "Pull up Grady's employee record." The file appeared on the screen. Years of service evaluations filled the document. Every supervisor who had ever worked with him described the same traits: reliable, polite, hardworking. At the bottom of the record was a more recent file submission. Caspian leaned closer. It was a maintenance complaint filed by Marlowe 2 weeks earlier. The document detailed unsafe chemical storage in the cleaning supply rooms and irregular overtime logging by the night management team. Caspian's eyes darkened as he read further. The report had been marked unresolved. He turned slowly toward Dorian. "You received this complaint." Dorian's voice was tight now. It was being reviewed. Caspian closed the file. The pieces were beginning to align with uncomfortable clarity. A janitor reports safety violations. Days later, a valuable item disappears, and the same janitor is blamed before anyone checks the evidence carefully. Caspian spoke quietly, but his words carried unmistakable authority. This wasn't an investigation. He looked directly at Dorian. This was an attempt to remove a problem. Later that night, the staff dining room was almost empty. The investigation in the security office continued behind closed doors, but Caspian needed a moment away from the screens and accusations. Snow drifted softly outside the tall windows. At the table, Ellie sat beside Marlowe, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa one of the kitchen staff had quietly prepared for her. The warmth had brought some color back to her cheeks, though she still looked worried. Marlowe watched the snow falling outside his shoulders, slightly hunched, as if he were trying to make himself smaller in a world that had suddenly become very loud around him. Caspian approached the table and took a seat across from them. For a moment, he simply studied the old man. The lines in Marlowe's face spoke of decades of labor, long nights, aching joints, and the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime working without applause. Finally, Caspian spoke. "Mr. Grady, how long have you worked in this building?" Marlowe thought for a moment. "Almost 22 years now, sir. Back when the old parking structure was still here." Caspian leaned back slightly. "Before the renovation." Marlowe nodded. "Yes. Different place back then. Smaller. Less shiny." Ellie looked between them, sensing something serious in the conversation, but not fully understanding it. Marlowe hesitated, then added quietly, "I almost quit once years ago." Caspian raised an eyebrow. "Why didn't you?" The old man looked down at his hands. "There was an incident one winter night. A man collapsed in the parking structure. Heart trouble. No one else was around." Caspian felt something stir in his memory. "You called an ambulance?" Marlowe nodded slowly. "Stayed with him until the paramedics came. It took nearly 15 minutes. Longest 15 minutes of my life." Caspian's voice dropped slightly. "Do you remember the man's name?" Marlowe thought for a moment. "Vale," he said. "Arthur Vale, I believe." The room seemed to go completely still. Ellie looked up, confused by the sudden silence. Caspian did not move. Arthur Vale had been his father. The man who had built the foundation of the empire Caspian later expanded. The man who had died only weeks after that winter night. Caspian's eyes remained on Marlowe. You stayed with him the entire time, Marlowe nodded. Didn't seem right to leave someone alone like that. Caspian exhaled slowly. For years he had believed the story ended with paramedics arriving too late. He had never known the name of the worker who had stayed with his father in those final moments. Until now. Marlowe noticed the change in Caspian's expression. Sir, is something wrong? Caspian looked at him with quiet intensity. No, he said softly. But it appears I owe you a very old debt. The morning after the discovery in the security room, the atmosphere inside Vale Galleria had changed. Word had spread quietly among staff that something serious was happening behind closed doors. The marble floors still shone, the stores still opened on schedule, and the wealthy shoppers still drifted through the luxury corridors, unaware of the storm unfolding beneath the polished surface. But in a private conference room overlooking the central atrium, tension hung thick in the air. Marlowe Grady sat at the far end of a long glass table, his hands folded nervously as he waited. Across from him sat two corporate attorneys from the mall's management company, their expensive suits crisp and their expressions professionally neutral. Between them lay a thin folder and a printed document. Caspian Vale stood near the window, watching the city outside while saying nothing. Dorian Pike sat beside the attorneys, unusually quiet. One of the lawyers finally slid the document toward Marlowe. Mr. Grady, she said gently, this agreement offers a financial settlement in recognition of the unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred last night. Marlowe looked confused. Misunderstanding. The lawyer nodded politely. You would receive a compensation package equivalent to several years of wages, as well as immediate retirement benefits. Marlowe blinked. But I didn't retire. The second lawyer folded his hands. The agreement would simply allow everyone to move forward peacefully. No public statements, no court filings, and no unnecessary stress. Marlowe glanced down at the document. The legal language blurred together, but one phrase stood out clearly: non-disclosure agreement. He looked up slowly. You want me to stay quiet? Dorian leaned forward. We want to resolve this professionally. Marlowe shifted in his chair. But you accused me of stealing. The lawyer offered a practiced smile. Which is why we're offering a generous settlement. Caspian turned slightly from the window but remained silent. Marlowe's eyes moved from the contract to Ellie, who sat quietly in a chair near the wall. She had been allowed to stay during the meeting because she refused to leave his side. Her small boots swung nervously above the floor. Marlowe sighed. I don't want trouble, he said quietly. I'm an old man. I just want things to go back to normal. Dorian nodded quickly. Exactly. Marlowe's hand moved toward the pen lying beside the document. Ellie suddenly spoke. Don't sign it. The room fell silent. The lawyers exchanged brief looks. Marlowe turned toward her gently. Sweetheart, sometimes it's easier not to fight. Ellie shook her head firmly. But you didn't do anything wrong. Marlowe hesitated. Sometimes that doesn't matter. Ellie looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up again. Her voice was quiet but steady. It matters to me. Caspian watched the exchange carefully. The lawyers were offering money to bury the truth. Marlowe was ready to accept it, because he feared dragging Ellie into something ugly. But the little girl sitting in the corner had just done something extraordinary. She had refused to trade truth for comfort. And in that moment, Caspian realized that the real battle had only just begun. 2 weeks later, the courtroom in Ashbourne's municipal courthouse was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the back benches, their cameras resting quietly on their laps as they waited for the hearing to begin. What had started as a minor internal accusation had grown into something much larger. Evidence of surveillance tampering and potential labor violations inside one of the city's most prestigious shopping centers had attracted serious attention. At the front of the room, Marlo Grady sat beside attorney Nadine Rowe, his posture stiff with nervousness. Ellie sat behind them with Caspian Vale, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched the room fill with unfamiliar faces. Across the aisle sat Dorian Pike and the legal representatives for the mall's management firm. The judge entered, and the room rose before settling back into silence. Nadine Rowe stood first. Her voice was calm but precise as she addressed the court. She explained how Marlo had been publicly accused of theft without proper investigation, how the surveillance footage presented by management had been altered, and how the accusation had conveniently followed his complaint about unsafe working conditions. The judge listened carefully, while the opposing attorneys attempted to argue that the situation had simply been an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the narrative began to shift once the video evidence was introduced. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the security footage appeared on a monitor. Nadine replayed the corridor scene where Marlo passed with his cleaning cart. She then displayed the reflection Caspian had first noticed. The image zoomed in, slowly revealing the silhouette of the security supervisor moving through the corridor with something concealed beneath his coat. The defense attempted to dismiss the reflection as unreliable, but Nadine followed with the system access logs showing exactly when the footage had been edited. Murmurs spread quietly through the courtroom. Caspian watched from the gallery, his expression unreadable. Ellie leaned forward slightly in her seat, listening to every word. For years, men like Dorian Pike had relied on quiet intimidation and convenient blame to silence employees who caused problems. But this time, the story had reached a courtroom where facts mattered more than convenience. Nadine paused before delivering her final point. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "Mr. Grady was not accused because evidence pointed to him. He was accused because he was the easiest person to blame." The judge leaned back thoughtfully, reviewing the documents before him. The room was completely silent now. Everyone understood that the next part of the hearing would determine whether this case ended quietly or exploded into something much larger. The courtroom remained silent as Nadine Rowe finished presenting the technical evidence. The defense attorneys attempted to challenge the reliability of the surveillance logs and reflections, but their arguments lacked the confidence they had carried earlier in the proceedings. The judge listened patiently before turning toward Nadine again. "You mentioned another witness," he said. Nadine nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned toward the back of the courtroom. "The court will hear from Elowyn Hart." A quiet ripple moved through the room as Ellie slowly stood from her seat beside Caspian. She looked very small, walking toward the witness stand, her green coat still slightly too large for her thin shoulders. Caspian watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration. This was not the place for a child, yet somehow she carried herself with remarkable calm. The bailiff helped her settle into the chair and gently asked if she understood that she must tell the truth. Ellie nodded. Nadine approached the stand, slowly keeping her voice gentle. "Ellie, can you tell the court what you saw on the night Mr. Grady was accused?" Ellie glanced briefly toward Marlo before answering. "We were in the service hallway," she said quietly. "I brought him a birthday cake." A few people in the gallery exchanged surprised looks. Nadine continued carefully. What happened next, Ellie described the evening step by step. She explained how Marlo had been cleaning the hallway, how they had lit the candle on the cake, and how the corridor had been quiet until the managers arrived. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke. The defense attorney eventually stood to question her. "Ellie," he said kindly, "you understand that grown-up investigations can be complicated. Are you certain you remember everything clearly?" Ellie thought for a moment before answering. "Yes." "Did you see Mr. Grady take a watch?" "No." "Did you see anyone else take the watch?" Ellie hesitated briefly, then she spoke again. I saw a man in a security uniform walk past the glass cases before the managers came. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. Nadine nodded encouragingly. Did you notice anything else? Ellie looked down at her hands, remembering carefully. There was silver dust on his sleeve, she said, like the sparkly powder from the watch display. The judge made a note while the defense attorney sat down, slowly realizing the testimony had strengthened the case rather than weakened it. Ellie's voice grew even quieter as she added one final thought. Mr. Grady wouldn't steal anything, she said. He shares his lunch with the stray cat behind the loading dock. A soft murmur spread through the courtroom. The statement was simple, almost innocent, yet it carried a sincerity that no legal argument could easily counter. The judge closed the case files slowly and looked across the room. The truth was no longer hiding behind missing footage or corporate explanations. It was standing plainly in the open, spoken by the smallest witness in the room. The courtroom felt heavier after Ellie finished speaking. Her small voice had left an unexpected silence behind it, the kind that made every person in the room suddenly aware that the story was no longer about a missing watch. It was about truth. Nadine Rowe rose slowly from her seat and approached the evidence table once more. Your Honor, she said calmly, the court has now heard testimony and reviewed the altered surveillance files. But there is one final piece of evidence. She handed a flash drive to the court clerk. This file was recovered from the backup server used by the mall's security network. Unlike the edited footage, this copy was automatically archived before anyone had a chance to modify it. The lights dimmed slightly as the video appeared on the courtroom screen. The corridor looked the same as before, quiet and polished. Marlowe pushed his cleaning cart past the camera and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, another figure entered the frame. The same security supervisor Ellie had described. The man glanced up toward the camera, quickly stepped inside the VIP lounge and emerged seconds later, adjusting something inside his coat. The timestamp continued without interruption. No missing seconds. No gaps. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Nadine allowed the video to play again before turning toward the judge. The theft occurred exactly as this recording shows. Mr. Grady was never inside the lounge. The defense attorneys sat rigidly in their chairs. Dorian Pike's expression had gone pale. The evidence that had once been hidden was now impossible to deny. Caspian Vale watched quietly from the gallery as the final illusion collapsed. For the first time since the accusation began, Marlowe Grady allowed himself to breathe. The judge studied the documents in front of him for several long moments before speaking. The courtroom remained absolutely still. When his voice finally broke the silence, it carried the calm authority of someone who had already reached a conclusion. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mr. Marlowe Grady was wrongfully accused. A ripple of relief moved through the room. The judge continued. The surveillance footage presented by the management team was intentionally altered, and the accusation against Mr. Grady appears to have been made without proper investigation. He paused briefly before finishing his statement. The court therefore orders that Mr. Grady's employment record be cleared immediately, and that the responsible parties be referred for further investigation regarding evidence tampering and retaliation. Marlowe lowered his head, overwhelmed. Nadine Rowe placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Across the room, Dorian Pike stared forward in silence, the confidence he once carried, now completely gone. Ellie turned in her seat toward Caspian, her eyes wide with quiet hope. Caspian gave her a small nod. The truth had finally reached the light. As the hearing concluded, the courtroom slowly began to empty. Marlowe stood carefully, his hands trembling slightly, as if he still couldn't believe the outcome. When he looked at Ellie, his eyes filled with tears. "You gave me back my name," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any verdict written on paper. Winter returned to Ashbourne 1 year later. Snow fell gently over the streets as warm lights filled the windows of Vale Galleria. Inside the building, the service corridor that once felt cold and forgotten had been transformed. The management had renovated the space into a small lounge for staff workers, complete with comfortable chairs, bright lights, and a plaque on the wall honoring employees who had served the mall for decades. That evening, a small group had gathered there again. Marlowe Grady stood beside the table looking healthier and stronger than he had the year before. His retirement had finally arrived with dignity instead of humiliation. Ellie Hart walked into the room carrying a cake box almost twice the size of the one she had dropped the year before. Caspian Vale followed behind her, smiling quietly. Ellie set the cake down on the table and opened the lid. Inside was a beautiful layered cake with bright frosting and several candles waiting to be lit. Marlowe laughed in surprise. "That's a much bigger cake than last time." Ellie grinned proudly. "I've been saving for it all year." The candles were lit, and the small group gathered around the table. As Ellie began to sing the birthday song again, Marlowe closed his eyes and made his wish. Across the room, Caspian watched the moment in silence. A year earlier, he had walked through this corridor without seeing the people who worked there. Now he understood something he had forgotten for far too long. The true strength of a place was not the glass, the lights, or the wealth inside it. It was the kindness of the people who refused to stop caring about one another. And sometimes all it took to remind the world of that truth was a little girl and a small birthday cake. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.